Hello. Welcome to the 5th episode of Peter York's Culture Wars House Party. I'm Peter York and my podcast is about culture wars, the way modern politics is so often played out with symbols, scapegoats and lying, astroturf organisations instead of the real things and the big debates. I'll be talking to the players and commentators in these culture wars and getting them to explain what they think is really happening. We'll have some fun, and we'll have some gossip, and we'll ask some really vital questions, like who makes the best suede loafers in Jermyn Street? My guest today is Peter Geoghegan. He's a writer I noticed well back before the pandemic because he was writing about the vital subject of the post-referendum world and dark money in politics. Big money from anonymous rich people smuggled into politicians' resources in clever ways. The brilliant Jane Mayer had already written the book on how dark money had changed everything in American politics in the last 30 years of the 20th century. Dark money, finance culture wars, and ultimately the rise of the populist right in America. The people and parties that seem to be coming from the grassroots, with us in mind, really were anything but. Peter Geoghegan followed these tracks in Britain, and his book, Democracy for Sale, published in 2020, showed that we were becoming as bad as the Americans, with one very important difference. We were doing corruption on the cheap. 20,000 bought you a lot in Westminster. Peter, good afternoon. How did you first get onto the trail of dark money and political fraudulence in Britain? What's your backstory?
Well, Peter, I'll tell you how I started. A long way. It's both I and this story started a long way from your salubrious surroundings in Pimlico, and I'm not sure if everybody who's listening to podcasts can see, but Peter is sitting in what can only be described as the grandest of circumstances. It's wonderful to see, surrounded by some beautiful works of art. I can see a lovely mirror. Peter's looking majestic, and it feels like I feel like I'm going to take us to a very different place, a very different part of the world. My background, I'm from a place, I'll tell you the potted history of Peter first, this Peter. I'm from a place called Longford in what's effectively in rural Ireland, a small market town in the middle of Ireland. Not the most spectacular place in the entire world, but we all have to be from somewhere, and that's where I grew up. I lived there until I was 17 years of age, and I'm from rural Ireland. Really, my family are all from there too. So yeah, that's kind of where I come from. I, after many circuitous routes, ended up in the UK, as many Irish people do too. I fell into a profession that's just the most secure of professions, journalism. You know, we all know what a famously secure profession is, so I ended up becoming a journalist. And how did I get into this area? How did I start writing about it? Well, this again was a long way from Pimlico. I was in Sunderland, in the northeast of England, back in 2016.
I've heard of it.
And you've heard of it, you've seen pictures possibly.
Yeah.
In June of 2016, just before the Brexit referendum, I was in Sunderland. And I was working as a freelance journalist for the Irish Times. And my editor at the Irish Times had said, look, I want you to go to Sunderland and write a kind of colour piece, a kind of piece of reportage ahead of the Brexit referendum, talking to people in Sunderland, seeing what's happening, looking at what's going down. And so I went to Sunderland, and while I was in Sunderland, I did that. I spoke to lots of people. I kind of left going, I think that place is going to vote for Brexit. Lots of people were very enthusiastic supporters of Brexit, as came to pass. But as I was leaving, I was standing at the train station, and I picked up a copy of the Metro, the free newspaper at the train station, and it had a big image at the front page that "Take Back Control," the slogan of the official Leave campaign from the referendum. And on the back, I noticed it had the logo of the Democratic Unionist Party, the DUP, and it said, paid for by the Democratic Unionist Party. I thought this was very curious. I used to work as a journalist in Belfast. What are the DUP doing funding adverts in Sunderland for the Brexit referendum? And I did what lots of journalists do. I took a picture of it I used to do in those days and put it on Twitter and kind of forgot about it. Just kind of said, and what was particularly interesting was I worked as a journalist in Belfast, so I knew the political donations in Northern Ireland were kept secret. They weren't made public. So I sent a picture going, I wonder if this is a way of getting around having to disclose where money came from because donations are secret in Northern Ireland. And I forgot about it. And about 6 months later, Adam Ramsey, who's then a journalist at Open Democracy, Adam got in touch saying, I heard you were interested in the DUP's Brexit referendum spending. I said, oh, well, yeah, I saw this in Sunderland. Because I saw the same in Scotland. Do you want to kind of do something together? So Adam and I started working on a story together, and we kind of started digging around. And we were able to just figure out that the DUP had spent almost £500,000 on its Brexit referendum campaign, almost every single penny in England, far away from God's own country of Ulster, and that we didn't know where the money had come from. And so we started publishing about this. And the story just became really quite fantastical, actually. The money had been routed through a thing called a Constitutional Research Council, which sounds very grand, but actually was a Pebble Dash semi-detached house in Glasgow. The person who was the kind of conduit for the money had been in business previously with the head of Saudi secret intelligence and a Danish gun runner. It was like an airport thriller or something. But at the root of it, my big takeaway was, wow, you can get money into British politics and not know where it comes from. And that was kind of how I started off on this journey, covering, now it's basically what I do all the time these days. But when I started this back in 2016, 2017, it was an area where I hadn't done much work before. And I must admit, I found it infinitely fascinating ever since.
You've been working for the Irish Times. You've written a book about Scottish independence and about Irish problems and so on. But you then went into the big league, the big stories. And did you transfer, as it were, to England at that point?
No, what happened at that point, Peter, was, and I think it was quite useful for me not to have been someone. I'd worked I was based in Scotland at the time. I'd worked quite a bit on and off in Holyrood as a journalist reporting Scottish politics. I'd worked in Northern Ireland doing similar. And I think the fact that I wasn't of the Westminster lobby in the Westminster world was quite useful. Yeah. I think it gave me a slightly different insight. I had a history doing investigations. I'd set up a thing in Scotland called The Ferret, which is an investigative website. I'd been at Channel 4, Dispatch is making investigative television. So I did have some of that kind of background, but I'd never really looked at politics before. And it was really eye-opening. And actually what happened then was I went and I did a lot of stories with Adam at Open Democracy, and I joined Open Democracy as its first investigations editor, eventually became the editor-in-chief. We did a lot of work on this, with a lot of work on money in politics, on dark money, this money that we can't see in our political system. And in some ways, I think having the background I had was probably quite advantageous, because I probably knew just enough to find things out, but not too much to, often I think one can get a bit jaded and a bit cynical and think that this is just the way the world works. And I think being outside of that really helped me to not be like that, to kind of look at this maybe with fresh eyes and go, hang on, is it not crazy that people can give money to think tanks anonymously, and those think tanks then lobby politicians and we don't know what happens? So all of that stuff, I think, probably came from me having that background that was slightly different.
What did you learn out of these years and those processes and those investigations about the structures and the alliances and the names? What did you learn that you absolutely hadn't known before? What came as a big surprise?
So there's a couple of things. One was, you mentioned at the start about the amount of money in British politics. And I think I probably would have been like a lot of people and being a bit like, it's not like America. America's got all this money, it's awash with money, it's rotten with money, and Britain's not the same. It's got problems, but it's not the same. And what I learned, and what took me a while to realise, was that the actual absolute sums don't really matter, because it's a closed economy. It's a closed circle of money that runs around British politics that everyone basically is chasing. All the different parties, all the different interest groups are chasing a small amount of money, because most people don't give money to politics in Britain. It's a minority sport. And the parties run on private money largely. What I realised was actually small amounts of money both could go very far in Britain, could get huge amounts of access. So, for example, we saw this with Robert Jenrick and Richard Desmond, the property developer. Desmond spent $8,000 getting a seat at a Tory fundraiser, sits next to Robert Jenrick, shows him a video of his big development in Tower Hamlets, says, look, it'd be great if you could help with this, because the council's bringing in this new tax. It's going to cost me £50 million. Jenrick calls in the development, and next thing you know, the tax is gone. So that's great return for your buck. You wouldn't get that in America. You'd never get that. So that was a big part of it. And as a result, actually, Britain is actually very, very susceptible to influence from money, even in some respects, possibly even more so, because you don't need to spend that much to get the influence. The other thing I kind of realised, and the other big thing I think that surprised me, I wasn't aware of what the rules and regulations were, but assumed that there was some. But actually just looking at how bad our rules are, how bad our regulations are. The Lobbying Act, for example, was brought in by David Cameron. That only records about 4% of lobbying that takes place because it's so bad. It only records lobbying between registered lobbyists who are not in-house lobbyists, so third-party lobbyists on behalf of companies, only with ministers and senior civil servants, and only in kind of registered meetings. So it's really, really bad. So David Cameron himself did not have to register as a lobbyist, even though he was a lobbyist for Lex Greensill, because he was employed directly by the company.
Yeah. What about the whole thing of organisations with rather vague names which did things you didn't completely understand, or, speaking for myself, I didn't completely understand. I didn't really know what a think tank was, because I'd assumed that think tanks were groups who aspired to be the Brookings or the Ford Foundation and so on. And I realise now they weren't a bit like that. What were they?
I think the think tank world was the thing that probably surprised me most and interested me most. And I'll tell you about how I got into that before I tell you about exactly what they are. I got into this in around the same time as I was doing all these investigations into the DUP's Brexit money, and Northern Ireland became a big story. And I as I say, I work in North. I'm from quite close to the border. Northern Ireland's a place I spent a lot of time in growing up, and so I was very interested in Northern Ireland. And this group I'd never heard of, called the Legasham Institute, and a man called Shankar Singham brought out a paper about the Northern Ireland border, how to solve this problem. If you remember back in the day during Brexit, it's a huge issue. And it was a quite remarkable paper. It got lots of publicity, and I read it, and it was remarkable because it was so completely awful. It was just nonsense. It had ideas like we could get basically Zeppelins to kind of go along the border to police it, including its 10 recommendations for the border. One of its 10 recommendations to solve the Irish border was to set up a fund for people to come up with creative solutions for the Northern Irish border. It really was rubbish. But it got publicity everywhere, and that made me, I started going, how is this possible? How is this really rubbish piece of research, not even research, kind of like a juvenilia almost, able to get so much attention? And I realised, this is how this is how these think tanks work. So the Gasham Institute, these other groups, these are effectively corporate lobbyists who describe themselves as coming up with policy proposals, etc., but who often don't declare their donors. So Shankar Singham, who was incredibly influential after Brexit, had dozens and dozens of meetings with government ministers. He actually left Legasham, because the Charity Commission wrapped Legasham on the knuckles, because most of these think tanks are also charities. So they're often pushing what are very political positions. But the Charity Commission wrapped Legasham on the knuckles for a report that Shankar had written. So he went and joined the IEA, the Institute of Economic Affairs, which is the think tank that quote-unquote incubated Liz Truss. And that incubator came from was actually seen as a positive sign. That was what Tim Montgomery, the former Tory spad, said of them when Truss got into office. And famously, Mark Littlewood responded on Twitter with a picture of a sunglasses emoji. But these are people basically that had a huge amount of influence in our politics, especially in the post-Brexit years. Really huge amount of influence. Able to get their politicians who were close to them into power, able to get their agenda. Truss's mini budget was basically that was think tank, that was Tufton Street in action. And it was quite remarkable. My book was written before that happened. It came out before that happened. And when I published it, some people did say, look, the book is I like the book, etc. But the stuff on the think tanks, you oversell how influential these people are. You overdo it. I'm sure you've been said by you two people, you overdo it. Funnily enough, no one's ever said that since Truss came into power to me. So since Truss's brief interregnum, which I think really showed how influential these groups have been. And I also felt, I think, again, it was one of those things that because I came at it from a slightly different position, I remember I was offered an interview with Shamir Sani, who was one of the whistleblowers from the Vote Leave campaign. And I spoke to him, and Carol did a brilliant story with him, front page story. He spoke to lots of other people. And I was just offered this interview, and me and a person who's helping with his media work. And I did the interview with him, and I knew he'd worked at the Taxpayers Alliance, and I spent the whole time just asking about that. And at the end of it, he said, no one's ever asked me about that before. And I felt like, look, lots of people are asking about Vote Leave. That story will get out. But actually, tell us about the Taxpayers Alliance, because rarely, which is another one of these think tanks or these pressure groups, rarely do we find out much about them. And it was very interesting hearing Shamir talking about how these groups operated. How they all had different names, and people like you and me, you talk about one group in the IEA and Taxpayers Alliance, the Adam Smith Institute, but actually behind the scenes there's incredible cross-mingling and actually very, very deeply connected. Many of them housed in this building at 55 Tufton Street that some listeners will have heard of. Very, very influential. And actually, I've done a lot more work on those think tanks over recent years. And last year, and I had a run up to the general election on Democracy for Sale, on the organisation I now run, myself and my colleague Lucas Amin, we created a big database trying to understand not just the money that gone into Tufton Street, but actually looking at who are all the people on the boards of these of Tufton Street organisations and how much money have they given to the Conservative Party and other political parties. And that was really interesting because you discover, actually, which I'd never really figured out before, almost all the people that are on the boards, especially people like the Centre for Policy Studies, are all huge Tory donors, like massive Tory donors. So it begs a really interesting question. What are these organisations? If the people who run them are Conservative donors, and you could see where they'd given money to these groups too by borrowing into their own charitable accounts. Well, does that not colour, who these people are? But yet, at the same time, they are often, and one of my big bugbears, and I'm sure yours too, Peter, is they're often presented to the public as if they're kind of neutral observers, as if they are not. They don't have a dog in the fight, and that is a big part for me as well. Is that these are often presented as independent organisations. They sound independent, policy exchange, etc.
Who presents them? Who is going about presenting people who are palpably not independent organisations? If you just look in a little bit, you don't have to go very far to know that these are very connected organisations, both amongst each other and with politics and big money. Now, who is it that's not letting that on to the public? And why aren't they letting the public know who these people really are?
I think some of it genuinely is people just don't really bother looking. They don't really want to know. They don't care. They just hear the name. They sound fine. Institute of Economic Affairs sounds like the Institute of Fiscal Studies. There was a survey done a couple of years ago, and only 1% of the population could name a think tank.
Yes.
So it's tiny. These are marginal things. I think trusts definitely put their influence much more front and centre. I think for journalists I would speak to, you're going too far on this, would be just like, look, they're just a bunch of people. Like, it doesn't, who funds them isn't that important. They're just a bunch of people who, they've got policy positions. You mightn't like them, I mightn't like them, but who cares? And I think until trust, that was hard. That was very much the line. And also they've got there is definitely editorial sympathy, in, especially the newspapers. The British newspapers tend towards the right. That is just a statement of fact. These think tanks tend towards the right. They also are very, very good. If you contact them, they will say yes to everything. There is probably not a media outlet that they would not say yes to. They might say no to like Press TV in Iran, but in terms of, say, the British media, a local radio station in Sunderland, in Caithness at the top of Sunderland, they'd probably say yes to too. So they're very good at filling the space, and they're also good at like producing. Like, often experts will say that their reports are very thin and are not substantive pieces of work, but they're also good at presenting these things and presenting them in very digestible ways that journalists who are time pressed, it's kind of, they're both a function. I think some of their current influence is a function of 24-hour news, where you have to get people on all the time, and time poor journalists that they feed into. And I think broadly some editorial sympathy, especially in the right-wing newspapers.
George Monbiot said everyone should read Madsen Piry's book because he made it plain that his think tank was always mixing it with sympathetic politicians and sympathetic journalists in the pubs of Fleet Street and so on, and that it was an absolute established set of networks. It wasn't at all accidental, and it wasn't a function of laziness either. So some people are very, very sympathetic to the various stories that those think tanks are peddling. Some people have very lazy researchers, but when you come to, let's say, ITN or the BBC, don't they have a filter? Or doesn't it work?
And I think this is part of the problem. I think what the think tanks have been very, very good at doing is occupying a space that seems to be, that fits really well with news agendas. And they would argue is underserved. Brexit was a great example. So what's fascinating, I think, is George is completely right about Madsen Piry, and George is right about lots of things. I get on very well with George, and he's great. And what's interesting is that was the high water period for the think tanks. So the late 70s, Keith Joseph, Centre for Policy Studies, these people really were plugged in, and they were writing the playbook for Margaret Thatcher. They were super, and there was a huge network and crossover. and very, very influential. Over the years, they became less influential, frankly. Through the late 90s into the New Labour era, that was a bad era. They struggled. Politics Exchange was set up around the early 2000s, partly to try and reinvigorate the right-wing think tank world. Money from Michael Ashcroft, Michael Gove was involved. It was an attempt to try and get back to where they were. But they didn't really have a huge amount of success. And I argue in my book, I think they had some success after the Conservatives got into power in 2010 in terms of cultivation. So what they did was they very actively cultivated a new network of MPs, often who, interestingly, because of the coalition government, weren't getting the kind of PPS jobs, the first rung on the ladder jobs into ministerial office that they might have got. The likes of Dominic Raab, actually, and Liz Truss, who were kind of actually very ambitious, but the kind of normal ways in which that ambition is contained within Westminster wasn't there because the Lib Dems were there. Lib Dems were taking loads of those jobs. They had to get loads of Lib Dems in junior ministries and PPS positions. So what you had was this big rump of very, very ambitious and quite right-leaning Tory MPs. And they became very close. This is important. I'm not understating this. This did become very important. And actually, there's a great clip on YouTube somewhere of Dominic Raab addressing the IEA's, what would have been 60th birthday in 2015. So before Brexit, he talks about going, it's very interesting, he talks about going for a swim in Brazil. He goes for a swim and comes out. He just goes out and in. But actually, he's way further down the beach than when he started because the current has brought him all the way down the beach. And he compares the IEA to that, this current that you don't see, that's moving politics. I think it's very interesting. It's well worth watching. And that is real. So that was happening. So you had this cohort. And you definitely had some sympathies, but it wasn't, they didn't have, this is the thing that's different, I think, to the Madison Peary era. They didn't have the ear of government in those days, really. They weren't really that significant. I think you'd struggle. They had some wins, but they were not as significant as they are. But Brexit then totally changed it. And the think tanks were one of the few places that were in favour of Brexit, most of them. So in the run-up to Brexit, they got loads more media appearances. And that became a way of getting them on again as well. That was really significant. Like, I know somebody who did a lot of broadcast work around then. If you were pro-Brexit, you were going to get invited on, but then also you're in the phone book. You're going to get invited on again and again and again. So that's a real part of it. So having those voices, and they became very important after Brexit. The BBC, ITN, and others, broadcasters who, unlike GB News, were looking at the Ofcom code and going, bloody hell, how do we balance here? How do we create some sort of kind of a fake balance? But how do we do it? They would look to these people, and because they were very, very effective. And whereas often in civil society, you had a lot of civil society organisations that would represent the interests of people whose interests were not represented by traditional politics in terms of, like if you're talking about housing, tenants organisations, etc. What effectively the think tanks did was represent the interests of capital, which are normally just represented by political parties. But they would then be able to go and do that, but from a position that looked like it was neutral. And the looking like it's neutral is completely and utterly key here. It's why they don't declare their donors. As soon as they declare their donors, they would end up being asked about it. And the illusion of neutrality will be gone. That's one of the absolutely key things. So the anonymity, and again, this is one of the things I learned from doing this work. The anonymity isn't just a hangover or something that one or two donors mightn't like. It's absolutely pivotal to be able to do this work.
So, were the BBC at fault when they introduced a variety of people, Kate Andrews, or were onto their shows on the telly and on the radio and said either nothing or that they came from a place called the IEA, which was a free market think tank? What on earth did that mean?
One thing I've never done is, from my own journalistic position, come up with a good way of articulating these. Like George Monbiot calls them junk tanks. I think there's something in that. And me being probably more of a straight-back journalist, I still call them think tanks. I don't think it's a particularly apt way of describing them. Libertarian think tanks, do I think that's a really apt way of describing them? I don't. Equally, free market think tanks. What you could say, we always have known quite a bit about who funds them. And I think it's not a secret. I think I could tell you right now who funds all of them. I'd be surprised if I'm wrong. It's mainly a bunch of Tory donors, because we can see it from work that I've done, and my colleague Lucas on Democracy for Sale, we've shown this quite clearly, that a huge amount of this money comes from Tory donors, and we know this because they have to declare it in their charitable accounts when they make inter-party. Basically, if you're a charity and you're on a charity board, you have to say if you're giving money to another charity. So we can see that. There's no one had really looked before. And actually, we also know from We know British American Tobacco gives them money because if you ask them, they'll tell you. We know BP have given them money for this. So we actually kind of know. It's not rocket science. There's a few names we don't know. It's not rocket science. We know what they are. And you could say that. Do you know, this is an organisation that's taken money from big BP, British American Tobacco, and is mainly funded by Tory donors. And I think that would be fine. We don't do that. And I think that is, and it really does matter. It's super significant. Like when I was at Open Democracy, we took over running Who Funds You, which was a really important project started by Clifford Sigger, which was looking at the transparency of think tanks and ranking them from A to E based on their transparency. And unsurprisingly, who was constantly in the bottom row? Who was the least transparent? All of these Tufton Street think tanks. And I think this was part of the reason, because if you were to really disclose who your donors are, it would force the likes of the BBC to say this.
But did you ever take the argument to the broadcasters?
Actually, we did, interestingly. I must publish this at some stage. We did last year. We published another story about how much media coverage the IEA had got from their company accounts. And Alan Smith, who was then an SNP MP, wrote to Tim Davie. And Tim Davie wrote back a kind of woolly letter about how, this was all within the bounds of editorial guidelines, etc., etc., etc. And so, frankly, the answer was not particularly satisfactory. But we probably should have published the letter in retrospect, I think, just to kind of show where that conversation was at, which is frankly not very advanced.
Because at that point, you have to ask the question, is it the pressures on researchers, which are sometimes very extreme? You've got to get somebody in half an hour. Somebody's fallen out. You've got to get somebody broadly to represent a certain kind of position who is available. Or is it something more difficult than that? Is it that they don't want to identify these people?
At the BBC level, my overarching sense is, particularly post-Brexit, that there was such a push to get pro-Brexit voices on. And I think that was a huge boon for the think tank world. I think that really was. And also, I think the BBC's been in a defensive crouch for a long time too, so I think that's a big part of it. Maybe it is, but I've never heard that from any producers. And as I say, what I've been struck by is over time, people I speak to in the BBC have probably become more sympathetic to my line of questioning. And I think they probably are broadly, I could be wrong on this, I'd be interested to see what the numbers look like. But my sense is that what the IEA, I think, and people like that are very good at, and I think where they get a lot of their mileage is on things like question time and stuff like that. And my guess is that's still the kind of area where it's really useful, especially during the Conservative government, where you had these groups that would kind of speak to Conservative talking points, but actually were seen as, could be badged as independent. Whereas, as you and I know, this independence is largely a chimera.
So when you take those notional requirements of balance, impartiality, etc., one of them, if the one of them who is assumed to be neutral, academic, outside of the argument in some way, turns out to be very clearly inside of it in a recognisable way, that's a way of getting round the balance requirement, isn't it?
This is what I think the point of these are. Oh no, completely. I think it's quite important to see this. Why would a Conservative donor fund these things? Right, what would be the point? Partly come up with policies the party might take on board, yes. But also, even in that frame, it's to do it in a way that suits you. It's to influence either the Conservative Party or the public debate. That's the two reasons you'd fund something like this, if you ask me. Looking at it objectively, I think that's quite clear. So why would you do that instead of giving the money to the political party? It's for that exact reason. It's the ability to influence the political debate in a way that looks neutral. When I wrote my book, Gutto Bebb, who was a Tory Welsh minister at one point, he said to me, look, if I had £250,000 and I wanted to influence British politics, I wouldn't give it to a party, I'd give it to a think tank.
Yes.
And I think that is the nub of this.
Because they'd use it more effectively.
Far more effectively. Well, even 30 grand would get you very far. We saw that with this thing that Greenpeace Unearthed did on the IEA back in 2019, where they had a fictitious investor interested in farming, and for £30,000, the IEA was willing to write a report. He wouldn't get to say, we wouldn't get to write the report, but they said, look, we know it to be in line with what you're interested in. He'd meet Michael Gove and government ministers. They'd have a launch. We'd get into their media. That's a lot of stuff for 30 grand.
It's fantastic value.
Incredible value, totally.
So that sort of thing, where you get exposure for your ideas in what I I think people call third-party endorsement, it's away from you, it's away from your money bags, etc., is very, very good value. But what else is dark money doing? It's putting these conceits, these ideas into the journalistic bloodstream. What else is it managing to do? What other tactics does it employ?
So dark money, which is a term that comes from Jane Meyer, the New Yorker journalist, which basically means any money that gets into the political system and has influence we can't see. So the think tanks is one, but there's lots of other ways. Buying ads on the internet or even just paying influencers or other people to kind of push political messages. That's a form of dark money. We've seen it quite a bit. Actually, it's really hard to trace. It's really hard to trace how that operates, how that works. You can also give money to political parties without us seeing where it comes from. Like Transparency International did some really interesting research recently where they discovered that they worked out that like at least 10% of all the money that's gone into British politics in 2011 has come from anonymous sources or sources that are hidden. So that's another way. So money can get into the bloodstream of British politics we just can't see. It can go through things that are called unincorporated associations. You can give money through British registered companies, but it's often the ownership is obscured. Loss-making companies making donations, so you don't know where the money has come. We saw that from Robert Jenrick during the summer. So there's a lot of other ways in which you can influence the political process in ways that you can't see. And effectively, that's what we're talking about here when we're talking about dark money, and how you're able to take advantage of a really complicated system of rules that are really porous. There's about 25 different statutes affecting electoral law, but actually the long and the short is that it's absolutely riddled with holes and was written for the pre-digital age. So we have a kind of landscape that's really, really porous, and lots of actors who want to influence it, because it's really important to remember that why would you want to influence politics without being seen? Because often it's far more effective if it is unseen. That's why big companies hire third-party lobbyists to lobby on their behalf. It's why you do this, because not being seen is often part of the process and part of the project.
When I first got enthusiastic about these sorts of issues, and when you first get enthusiastic about things, you burble on everyone you know, and I found it particularly difficult explaining to a lot of people I knew how internationalized these pressures were, how internationalized the dark money in question was, not just because we were dealing with very big global companies, but also because we were dealing with very big global forces and sometimes individuals like the Koch brothers, where in part, of course, the Koch brothers had its own particular interests, because they were very much in fossil fuels, but also because they got a generalized mission to push back the tide, as they saw it, of socialism, push back the tide of regulation, etc. And they and a number of other people did that not just in America, but it seemed that they were working with people here. Can you tell us a bit about that? How international money thought, now we've mopped up America, let's mop up Little Britain.
Yeah, I think this is a really important part of this story as well. And also that, like, as you touched on there, often we conceive of lobbying and influence. I think this is also one of the things you asked me at the start, what I've learned from this. I think often we conceive of lobbying and influence in very narrow terms. Rich person X or rich company X wants to change policy proposal Y because it's either going to be in their detriment or they would benefit from the change. So they're either trying to block something or make something happen that will improve their financial situation. And that happens. We see this. I write about this all the time. This is what a large part of the lobbying industry is about. Is trying to, get advantages for either individuals or corporates vis-a-vis public policy. But there's another side of it, which is about trying to change much wider, this kind of much bigger intellectual landscape within which we do things. I wrote about Paul Marshall in the London Review Books recently, and I think he fits within this. Paul Marshall, he now owns Spectator, he owns the website Unheard, he's one of the biggest backers of GB News. He formerly was a Lib Dem, but then became a Brexiteer and funded the Tories. He's very interesting backstory. I wrote a very long essay about him. But what I think Paul Marshall is trying to do is, Yes, some of the things he's done and some of the things he's interested in benefit his business, but I don't think that's a primary goal here. I think it's about a much wider, almost system change, a much wider changing of the international, of the kind of the entire kind of underpinnings of how we do things. And that's been a big thing. We saw that's what's happened in America. It's partly what the Koch brothers were funding in America. And we have seen, and we do see some of that influence, not just in the UK, but in lots of other countries. If you look, take the think tank world, for example. There's a thing called the Atlas Network. So the Atlas Network is a group of more than 400 think tanks. It was set up, this umbrella organization, by Anthony Fisher. Who was Anthony Fisher? Anthony Fisher is the guy who set up the IEA, the Institute of Economic Affairs, which is often seen as the first ever think tank in this world, the first libertarian think tank. So it was kind of the text for all of these groups. The connections between Tufton Street and DC and K Street, the kind of lobbying industry in DC, are real. We've seen that. We've seen lots of people go over and back, spending time in one and the other. But not just that, the debate and the kind of what happens in the States in particular does influence what happens here. I think we can see it more clearly now than ever under Donald Trump. We saw it with this ARC conference recently, where we had all these people coming over. And actually, Paul Marshall talked about talking to 1,000 people in America about to try and spread his message. A lot of Jordan Peterson's the kind of head of this ARC network, which is funded by Paul Marshall as well. We saw actually Jordan Peterson having quite a slightly toe curling interview with Nigel Farage, where Nigel Farage looked a bit like uncomfortable at being interviewed by Peterson. And Kemi Badenoch used the conference to say that in order to save Western civilization, we must vote for the Conservative Party. But I thought it was very interesting as a microcosm of these connections. These connections are very real and very there between the kind of, whatever, if you want to call it libertarian right, populist right, political right in the US and the UK. And this similar we're seeing internationally. What's fascinating, I think, about someone like Elon Musk is he really says the quiet part loud. He is actively on Twitter saying vote for reform. He's actively addressing the AFD's conferences. So we can really see it as very, very, and this was, I think, was far more under the surface for a long time. But I think in some ways what we're seeing now is a manifestation of something that has existed below the surface for a long time.
People who don't enormously like Elon Musk, or for that matter, Peter Thiel, do point out, or David Sachs for that matter, do point out that these middle-aged men spent their formative years in apartheid South Africa. Is that a cheap shot, or do you think it could be important?
It depends what the premise of the conclusion, whether it's a cheap shot. I think it's very. I think on one level it's got to be seen as at least worth having a conversation about and having an interest in. It's a very specific political context, and these are three people who have inordinate amounts of political power now. And I think it does behove anyone to ask, these are all unelected people, the people who do not hold elective office, who have, we can see it, far more power than pretty much any elected politician besides Donald Trump. These are people who are very much setting the agenda. Who is more powerful? The top-ranking senators in the GOP are Peter Thiel and Elon Musk. It's no contest. So the background, and these are backgrounds that they haven't had to stand for before. If they were elected politicians, you'd be asking, okay, what about? They'd have to field questions like this, and because they're not, they haven't. So I think it does behove us to kind of ask those questions.
Then another linkage, you were talking earlier about the Legatum Institute. Well, the founders of the Legatum Institute, the Legatum Group, are equal shareholders, 42.2% in GB News with Sir Paul Marshall. And Sir Paul Marshall, surprise, is a hedge funder. Hedge funders seem to be very highly represented amongst people who are active in these areas. Is that true?
I think there is. I think it's very interesting. There is a big hedge fund kind of engagement and interest in this. But I think there's a bunch of reasons behind it. I think some of it is self-perception. The hedge funders like to see themselves as kind of chippy underdogs. They're kind of fighting the fight. They're their own self-made men. And also, hedge funders make a lot of money from volatility and chaos. This is a well-known thing.
Yes.
And I think that has to be taken as part of this. Chris Benodi, I think, embodied it when he talked about, waking up on the morning after the Brexit referendum with the feeling of gold in his mouth, having shorted sterling on the back of a Vote Leave campaign that he'd financed. This is quite a striking combination of positions.
Now, you know what I'm going to say next. Some people on the right like to point to George Soros in relation to all this, that he betted on politics.
I think he did. I think it's Soros obviously made a lot of money in betting and shorting sterling and lots of other things too. I think it's perfectly a very legitimate ask, like what has Soros funded and what's it done? I think the interesting bit, like if you look at some of the stuff Soros has funded, I think it kind of sits in a different place in terms of like, they fund a lot of things that I think are not sexy and cool, like, drug legalization policies and pro-traveller movements and things like that, like policies and people who are and I think that runs through it, the sense of minorities and people who are outside of society. So I think they've done a lot of work that fits into that. But what I think in some ways, what Soros and Soros's funds have also done is create bogeymen to kind of hold up and go, look, you guys are doing it here. And I think that's a big, I think that's real too. I think that's allowed. I saw it at Open Democracy, and I used to run Open Democracy, and you'd see these big spider diagrams, Soros funds X, and then so this, this goes to this, goes to this. And because we occasionally would receive funding from some of Soros's foundations, and but it was always just a small percentage of the overall funding, but you would see that. So I think in some ways it's allowed a kind of bordering on conspiracy theories, especially the way Soros is presented as a bogeyman who wants to create some kind of world government, etc. I think the difference or the challenges I would see sometimes are that rather than a kind of the Koch brothers, this kind of sense of, right, we're going to create a situation that is a worldview we want to produce, is going to be also very beneficial for our general business. I feel like what Soros has done sits often at odds with that, not always, but often.
One very marvellous bit of history is, and you'll tell me if this is right, that way long ago, Soros funded Viktor Orban's elite London education.
Yes, he did, yes.
That he paid for him to go wherever it was, UCL, LSE.
I think he was a Soros fellow. There's lots of Soros fellows. Some of whom have become huge anti-Soros people for various reasons. But there was a lot of Soros fellows, and one of whom was Viktor Orban. Back in the 90s, so Soros did fund a lot of, and Viktor Orban was one of the people that benefited from one of. And the same way that Paul Marshall, as I mentioned in a piece, some of the seed funding that Paul Marshall got for Marshall Waste came from George Soros. And in fairness, Paul Marshall, I think he has been close and is still close to George Soros. So these are not always completely delineated worlds as well. It's worth remembering.
When I talk about these worlds, which I do a bit now, I say that if you were a real person, and for the convenience of the moment, I'm saying neither of us is a real person because we've gone through a process whereby we know stuff that we might have found astonishing 15, 20 years ago. But if you were a real person and you lived in a real place, let's call it Rotherham or Rutherglen, and you did a real job, you were a GP or a carpenter or an Amazon dispatcher or any of the real jobs that people do, and you were getting your family fed, you were paying the mortgage, you were keeping up with your friends, you were living your life, you wouldn't know any of this. In a simple sense, you would not have the faintest idea, quite understandably, of what a hedge fund was. You wouldn't know what a think tank was. You said 1% of people could identify a think tank. You wouldn't know what a lobbyist does. You wouldn't know what a SPAD does. You'd have only the faintest idea what the political editor of a national newspaper did, etc. Because they don't seem like real jobs to real people. Is it desirable that real people should know about these unreal jobs and unreal processes?
I think very much so. I think this is really important. I think, I'm going to butcher the quote from Maynard Keynes on this, but, this idea that politics and economics is what he was talking about. Often, if you're not aware of what's happening, it's happening to you effectively.
Yes.
And I think that's really important with all of this. I think it is really important. Liz Truss was the apotheosis of it, but the idea that these are things that happen discreetly in some other world. Often I don't care about politics, but politics cares about you. So I think it is. I think it's absolutely incumbent on us to talk about this, to reveal this stuff and to kind of put it out into the public domain for precisely that reason. Because if you are busy going about your daily life, you don't have the time to do this, but that doesn't mean it doesn't affect you.
Well, it seems to me, I I am, by background, a market researcher, management consultant, and that sort of person. And I know top bananas of all kinds are very interested in what the rest of us are thinking and feeling and doing, and what we might do in our Facebook posts, and above all, in our votes. So they are constantly scrutinising us in ever more elaborate ways, and the sort of grifters who ran Cambridge Analytica were suggesting to people that they could practically get inside our heads. And that's a set of processes that perhaps people ought to know more about.
Yeah, I would agree. This is something that's really important. We can see, look at how the world around us has changed so dramatically. Look what's happened in America. Look what's happening here. Look what's happening in Europe, the rise of the AfD. I think we have to fundamentally ask, how is this happening? What other processes are happening that we're not seeing? How are people getting animated by some of the things that do not exist? Things that are just not real. The Haitians were not eating the animals in Springfield, Ohio. How is this happening? And how is this influencing us? I think it's huge. These are huge key questions that I think it behoves us all to ask them. And I feel fortunate to have a job that's trying to do that, even if I can't succeed all the time.
So, ordinary people thinking that there was a real and present danger that when their wives were in the ladies' room at a hotel, they were in danger of being raped by a transsexual. So far as I know, it hasn't happened. It's never happened. Or that the people who came over on those boats were overwhelmingly either drug dealers or political extremists. That seems rather unlikely, but why does nobody do a real comprehensive set of demographics of those people? It's not difficult. It would be useful in strategizing deterrence. But I don't know in any consistent way who those people are, more than just sometimes the countries they come from. What about that stuff? The making of stories, the makings of culture wars.
I think how our worlds and how our stories are made and how the things that dominate the conversations we have is really important. I think this actually also loops back to the think tank world, frankly, which is, it's not that the think tank world is constructing stories, say, about migration or whatever else, but the point is that there's only ever a limited bandwidth in the public domain for conversations. There's only so many conversations that are ever happening at one time. So what the think tank world is very good at doing is occupying some of those spaces, the limited spaces, and forcing conversations on certain topics. We're now seeing this not necessarily from some of the conversations you would see from the think tank world, from the Tufton Street world, but around things, say, like migration. And what is happening is how those conversations are framed, as you're saying, becomes completely and utterly determinate. How we talk about it, how we talk about, like, if it, as is currently the case, is on the heads of the news, how many people came over on a small boat in the last week or whatever, that becomes determinative of how those conversations happen. And I think that's something that we have always underestimated, and frankly underestimated when we talk about, like, say, and that's where social media, I think, has become really, really important. That's where Elon Musk's is a really good example of an ability to create conversations, create attention, curate attention. And I'd almost end my kind of conversation with saying that I think the big change that's happening, it's a change that I am seeing already in my work, is that the influence which kind of once came purely from money is now more coming from attention. Sometimes money can buy attention, but not just money. Money is not the only thing that affects attention. What I mean by that, say, take Elon Musk as an example. Where has he had more influence? From giving $300 million to the Trump election campaign in 2024, or by how he used Twitter in the run-up to the 2024 presidential election? I think almost nobody would say the former and all of the latter. And that is about attention. That's about capturing attention. That's about using attention. I think that's where we are now. And I think that's a change that probably a lot of people, myself included, have been slow to realise.
Many, many thanks, Peter Geoghegan. And if you want to look up what Peter's doing now, look for, what should they check out?
Check out Democracy for Sale. It's a
Democracy for
Sale newsletter. We're on Substack, and you can sign up for the newsletter. You get all of our content for free. We might ask you for money occasionally, but yeah, It's a mix of investigations, exclusive stories, and comment and analysis from this world, trying to make sense of how dark money and influence works in our politics.
And we can get it all for less than 20,000 quid.
You can get it all for much less than 20,000 quid. That's true. You see, that's it. Yeah. Maybe I am the new IEA.
Thanks a million.
Thank you so much, Peter. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Many thanks to Peter Geoghegan for those amazing revelations about those extraordinary networks, connections, and unknown impacts and stories on our lives and the lives of people across the world. The next episode of my podcast, I'll be talking to Graydon Carter, who was editor of Vanity Fair from 1992 to 2017. So it's Hollywood, Manhattan High Society, and Wall Street. Do listen in. Thank you. Goodbye.